them to make long-term decisions on car purchases without the fear that government will hike up their taxes in the near future. The decision to incentivise low CO2 emission vehicles is having a real impact on Ireland's efforts to contribute to tackling climate change. 88% of new vehicles since 2008 have been purchased in the HC bands as motorists have responded to the incentives, switching from high-emission cars to low CO2 emission vehicles. The switch was taken on the basis of the financial incentives provided. The government is now, we believe, further jeopardising that progress. The connection between the rate of tax you pay and the CO2 emissions from your car was at the heart of the introduction of CO2-based bans in 2008. It ensured a link in the motorist's minds and, most importantly, their wallet between driving an environmentally friendly car and paying a low motor tax rate. This bill obviously further erodes that connection. It downgrades the importance of environmentally sound practices at the heart of broader public policy. The measures designed to incentivise clean and fuel-efficient cars was a direct response to the growing threat of climate change, as laid out in detail in the seminal Stern report. Unabated climate change could cost the world at least 5% of GDP each year. If more dramatic predictions come to pass, the cost could be more than 20% of GDP. The cost of reducing emissions could be limited to around 1% of global GDP. People could be charged more for carbon-intensive goods. What we do now can only have a limited effect on the climate over the next 40 to 50 years. But what we do in the next 10 to 20 years can have a profound effect on the climate in the second half of this century. In relation to the costs to motorists, to elaborate, a recent Eurobarometer survey on the issues that Irish people rank as most important that are facing them personally. Cost of living was ranked highest by 44% of respondents. Car sales have dropped by 12.5% last year, illustrating the challenges the industry faces, which the bill will only serve to worsen. How seriously can we take future promises in relation to incentivising environmentally friendly purchases when previous commitments are not being honoured? Rising fuel prices over the past number of years are a growing concern for motorists, and these motor tax increases further hit hard-pressed households. Rising fears about the impact of the Iranian embargo and the volatile situation in the Middle East, exacerbated by the euro crisis, means the €2 barrier per litre of petrol could potentially be breached this year. These increases further penalise motorists on top of these broader global developments. And when we search and talk and assess the response of those involved in the industry, to quote some I might mention, AA Ireland, for example, said that there was no way to dress it up. The car tax increase announced by government will push up the cost of living for car owners, affecting almost every household in the country. For vehicles bought from this year onwards, there is some justification for an increase, or fairly soon every car on the road will be tax band A. Such is the progress being made on emissions. However, for the cars already on the road, this is a tax increase, pure and simple. In addition, Conor Faulkner, who's Director of Consumer Affairs with AA Ireland, said the drivers of older vehicles will feel harshly treated. Those pre-2008 cars are already highly taxed, and they're not luxuries. In many cases, ordinary motorists can barely afford to keep them on the road. And for anyone who bought a low-emission car on a low-tax promise, the day of the announcement was the day that the promise was broken. It is clearly an act of bad faith, affecting over 300,000 motorists who believed the promise and bought a cleaner, greener car in the last 4 years. The Society of the Motor Industry commented on the increases, the tax increases, by stating that the motorist is already paying enough tax to be on the road. New car sales are down 10,000 on last year. We've always said that more tax will be generated from increasing the sale of cars rather than increasing taxation. We are opposed to the Motor Vehicles Bill. It marks a continued government attack on motorists struggling to make ends meet, with rising living costs betraying the incentives set out in 2008 to purchase environmentally friendly cars. The financial incentives put in place in July 2008 to encourage drivers to switch to fuel-efficient cars with low CO2 emissions was a core feature of efforts to tackle climate change. This bill exacerbates last year's increases and further erodes the progress made in placing environmental concerns at the heart of public policy. It penalises those motorists who took the decision to use environmentally friendly cars by shifting the goalposts in the middle of the game. I would also like to draw attention to some of the comments the Minister made. I'm conscious of the comment when you said the bulk of road tax would go back to local authorities. That we have a diminishing road tax take. The provisions to be enacted into legislation next week in relation to the property tax have also, you've explained obviously in the past, will form the basis of funding for local authorities also. And in the event of you obviously have a figure which you expect to obtain. In the event of you not achieving that figure, can you say today that local authorities will be subvented and that they won't be penalised in the manner in which they were last year for the failure in relation to the household charge, despite the inadequacy of preparation that was put in front of them prior to its then being the collectors? But if I look at the various forms of income for local authorities, if the road tax take will be down, if the property tax doesn't meet your expectations, I can tell you most definitely rates will be down, commercial rates. We can say most definitely the development charges will be down again. We can say most definitely the planning fees will be down. And we can say it's insignificant any other income that arises or bears to local authorities, whether it be libraries or fire charges and so forth. And that being the case, will we see a further erosion of funding to local authorities? And I'm particularly conscious in this debate to mention the difficulties local authorities are facing in relation to their road maintenance and road restoration grants. We all know the progress that was made in the area of primary routes and national primary routes throughout the country in the last number of years. And we all know that there was much success in relation to many county roads also. But over the last couple of years, with the fall in funding being provided to local authorities for ongoing maintenance even, let alone the fall in relation to restoration and repairs and resurfacing and so forth, it is now becoming very evident in this year, this calendar year, the effect that that is having on our road structure throughout the country, especially, as I said, non-national roads, county roads and local roads. And I know from meeting people in my own constituency who are beginning to show up at advice clinics with invoices, with repairs for cars and tyres and so forth. And I know from talking to councillors that this is the most pressing issue at present in my local authority. And is it that you can give a commitment to seek to address this, to seek to carry out an audit across the local authority system, that I believe that this may be a crisis point now at this stage? And what procedures are you putting in place to address this? What ways or means can different local authorities access funding in order to address their issues? If, for example, in my constituency or my county, which those roads, 40% of our roads, for example, have a peat foundation surface, and they are not similar to many other counties who wouldn't have that problem. And obviously the maintenance and restoration costs associated with that would be far greater than any other. And what equalisation process is in place or can be put in place by virtue of centralised funds to local authorities? Is it that, for example, in relation to this fund from the road tax take, have you devised any mechanism to address this issue, which is approaching crisis situation at present? When you hear, I don't know the exact situation in Athboy, for example, whereby a Patrick's Day parade can't take place because of the state of the road in that town. And this, I believe, is only the tip of the iceberg in relation to what's coming down the tracks in this regard. And I think it's incumbent on you now, Minister, to give a commitment to the House today, in the context of this bill, which historically and continues, that the income generated by virtue of this source is the funding for roads throughout the country. That you will make a commitment to this House to consult with the relevant authorities throughout the country and assess the situation nationally and devise a mechanism by which this may be tackled as soon as possible in order to stop the rot. Because, as I said, it's an issue that has to be addressed, and there has to be a constructive effort to do so, and a means and a mechanism by which it's done. But a greater and a fairer distribution of resources to those who need it most. And as I said, I'm only using as an example the situation of Offaly, with the amount of peat foundations in their road network throughout the county. Other counties will have other reasons by which, whether it be excessive rainfall or whatever the case may be, or the amount of developments that take place, or whether there's a lot of sand pits and whatnot, and the damage that they can do. And I know cause can be made for conditions of permissions not being adhered to, and enforcement regimes within local authorities can do a lot more also. But let that form part of the overall solution. But a solution may be proposed, debated and agreed very soon, before, as I said, it gets out of hand, because it is a crisis point. But to reiterate our own points, we do not believe that you can achieve in this bill, by virtue of what you've proposed, while we agree that there to be some savings made in this regard, we don't believe it can be done by virtue of simply putting up regressing the progress that had been made in relation to low CO2 emissions in the past number of years. I think all that is thrown out by virtue of what's proposed here, and indeed last year in this regard. Thank you very much.
Deputy Dessie Ellis.
Minister, the Irish motorist, the motor industry and businesses which rely on private public transport vehicles have sharply felt the effects of the recession in terms of motor-related costs, car sales and employment in the industry. Budget 2030 included new measures that will have a further effect on both consumer and car dealers. The Irish motor trade was and remains a significant employer in this state. The sector accounted for 49,600 employees at the beginning of 2009, but it shed 14,300, or 29% of its workforce, by the end of that year. Sales of both new and used cars are down as the customer feels the bite of lower disposable income, restricted lender financing and higher motor-related charges. It is essential for our economy that people can operate vehicles to get to work and to do business. A balance, of course, must be struck with the need to raise revenue and protect the environment. The balance, I feel, in this bill has been set wrong and puts too much burden on motorists and doesn't target fuel inefficiency enough. Successive changes in motor tax, VRT and excise duty costs have added to the strain of the industry. Fuel duty on petrol and diesel has already seen 5 changes alone since 2008. Irish motorists will be spending $1,400 a year more on fuel than they did just 3 years ago if current forecourt prices are maintained. In total, motorists are paying 23% VAT on motor fuel, in addition to mineral oil tax and carbon tax of 58.8% per litre on petrol and 47.9% per litre on diesel. The motor tax system received a significant overhaul in 2008 as the government moved from an engine-based tax to a carbon emissions-based tax. In line with most other Western European states, the number of EU countries with CO2-related car taxation has gone up to 15 in 2009, and Germany moved to the system in 2010. This move from engine capacity to emissions-based taxation had the intended effect of shifting consumption towards more environmentally friendly vehicles. However, it also had the effect of collapsing motor tax receipts and negatively impacting on the used car sales market, as cars registered before 2008 stayed in the old tax system based on engine size. The motor tax system is currently attaining its desired outcome, that of directing consumers away from fuel-inefficient cars. The system must be made to take into account the carbon emissions of an engine capacity, and the value of a car in a fair, progressive, tax-positive manner. This must all be done in conjunction with a target-based climate change policy, like the one recently published by my colleague Brian Stanley. It will also find ways to support motor-based industries, which may make the shift to greater fuel efficiency, but will still have to deal with a high and rising cost of doing businesses. Over the last few years, the cost of staying on the road for many motorists has climbed considerably, while public transport alternatives have also risen in costs and services have been cut. There are many more people today who need private transport more than ever. This is a problem from an environmental point of view, which is key to all our policy in the face of climate change. But this problem is precipitated by the large cuts to public transport, which is more environmentally friendly and efficient, but requires political will, planning and vision to provide properly. Many people are left with no alternative but to use private transport, and they're being forced to pay more now for something they had no choice in. An average motor tax on private cars registered from July 2008 will go up by €53 a year. These vehicles have already had their motor tax raised in previous years, and this is quite a large hike considering this. It will surely for some people be the straw that makes private transport unavailable to them, given the very tight budgets many people operate on today. Businesses also are on tight budgets. Small businesses, which employ many people across the state and which the government claims to want to help, will be hurt also by this budget. Goods vehicles needed for doing business, for employing people, will be on average taxed €117 more a year. This might not put goods vehicles off the road, but could have the negative effect of workers getting less hours or pay cuts in order to shore up profit for the business, as is unfortunately a far too regular practice. VRT is also set to go up by as much as 3%, making it more difficult for people to upgrade their vehicles to more environmentally and economically friendly vehicles, which would be liable for less motor tax. This is a particular problem for many of the taxi drivers I am in contact with through my office. They will, through new regulations, have to upgrade their vehicles regularly to keep them up with more regular testing after 9 years. These are people who are struggling to pay their bills and fill the taxi with petrol as well. It is also worth noting that higher VRT makes upgrading to more fuel-efficient and environmentally friendly vehicles more difficult for motorists who otherwise would like to do so. Ordinary people seeking to drive to work, small businesses seeking to transport their goods, even school buses, tractors, hearses and construction vehicles are now less affordable, and people are once again hit harder by this government for no other reason than their unwillingness to tackle those on high earnings. The system of taxing motor vehicles must be reviewed and future-proofed by redesigning the motor tax bands to reflect carbon emissions, engine capacity and vehicle value. This will make the system progressive. The more expensive and inefficient the car, the more tax is paid. This will also maintain the incentive to purchase environmentally friendly vehicles. This reviewed system would, I believe, generate more revenue, and this revenue increase on currently could take and should redirect it in order to reduce excise duty on petrol and diesel. Fuel costs are having not just a detrimental effect on consumers but on businesses as well. Hauliers, for example, have pointed out last year the need for a rebate on fuel costs in Ireland. The government listened, and good and well and truly they listened. And I think coach owners are being listened to as well now. I welcome it, of course. Cost pressures on the haulage sector had seen large licence numbers drop by 1,300 in the last 3 years, which is estimated to represent 10,000 job losses. Similar helpful measures must be looked into for other businesses for whom petrol and diesel is a large part of their expenses. Sinn Féin in its budget submission put forward a budget-neutral way of cutting excise duty on fuel by 5%. This was not adopted, but would have had a very positive effect on the balance sheets of many businesses and household budgets. Increasing motor tax revenue can be done in a way which is fair and continues to encourage a move to more environmentally friendly vehicles if we have followed the approach of scaling rates on the basis of vehicle price, CO2 emissions and engine capacity. Doing this would allow the state to help struggling businesses, which would only further help the local economy, protect jobs and stimulate further the motor industry. People are not seeing the benefits of where these taxes are going. There are so many taxes now attached to the motor industry. We've tolls, we've meters, we've the tax itself on motor vehicles. We have all these taxes that are being done. People are not seeing the benefits in their local authority areas. It's essential. We are going to drive people away from work because we are not allowing them the opportunity to use their own vehicles because the costs are too high. This is the danger. We're going to cut down on the revenue eventually by making it too costly. I also want to raise an issue in terms of garages and the disparity between garages across the country in terms of the prices that they are charging, Minister. In Dublin, the north side of Dublin seems to be dearer than the south side of Dublin. Other areas, the prices seem to vary. I don't understand the reasoning behind it, but maybe, Minister, you will look into this and see what's the reason behind this. And some of these garages need to be tackled. Some of them need to be brought in here and explain why there's such a disparity across this city and across the whole country. Other European countries have moved more and more towards the emissions, and we are moving away. We did give the motorists a kick in the teeth back in 2008 when we did incentivise them to have CO2-friendly cars, and all of a sudden we were reneged on that, and this has been a big blow to motorists. This has been driven by a loss of revenue, not in terms of how environmentally friendly the whole issue is in terms of CO2 emissions. That's one of the problems in terms of the approach that we have. We are opposed to this bill because we believe it's out of proportion to what's needed to generate proper revenues in the industry and also to address the industry as a whole and to make it more fairer. It is unfair to be looking at this on the basis of a tax raising revenue, and that's all it is. Instead of, we need to be looking at this in terms of our emissions. How friendly are we meeting the European requirements in this? And Europe is moving more and more in this direction. And so, thank you, Dáil.
Alex, now call Deputy Catherine Murphy.
Basically, this bill is about charging more and delivering less, and that's really the hallmark of this government. The cost of going to work, the cost of leisure, the cost of going to school, the cost for people who exist particularly in fairly rural areas that don't have public transport is climbing to a point where people are not able to afford to move. And at the same time, you're seeing public transport withdrawn. In my own constituency, I can see I had 30 people onto me where a bus service has been withdrawn for a school. That means possibly maybe 20 parents getting into cars and trying to get their children to school. So you're not giving them a choice. The major increase in motor tax is to be brought about in this bill is more of the same, regressive, taking money out of people's pockets, and essentially it's contributing towards deflating the domestic economy. Last year, motor tax rates went up substantially by as much as 40% in some cases, and here we're seeing more of that. Originally, motor tax, and Minister, you drew attention to it in relation to your own contribution. The motor tax was ring-fenced to go towards the local government fund to provide services. But essentially, since 2009, at the peak, that local government fund has fallen by 348 million. It went from $1 billion to 650 million in that time, and 150 million. You tell us in your contribution or your opening statement that a further 150 million will be transferred back to the Exchequer this year. That leaves a sum of 500 million, and that's the exact same figure that is due to be taken in at best on property tax. And of course, local authorities have lost income from commercial rates, metered water, development contributions, planning fees, and a whole lot of other things. So essentially, their incomes have fallen substantially. Yet at the same time, we've seen the motor tax costs rising, and when you take into account increases in lower emission bands last year, including these new increases, some in a category, in some categories you can see that the increase has been as much as 92%. I remember having a discussion or a debate with Minister Rabbitte in relation to ring fencing funds, and I was looking for the carbon tax fund to be ring fenced, and I was told that it was never done and it wasn't possible. Yet you know, and I know, and everyone else here knows, that the local government fund was taken from a ring fenced motor taxation fund. The reality of it is, this is not about motor tax. It's not about carbon tax. It's not about property tax. What it is it's a different name for collecting general taxation that goes into a general pot. There may well be the property tax, if it takes in as much as it does, may be predominantly spent at local government level, but there's 35% that I don't see there's a whole lot of guarantee about in relation to that. The interesting thing is, Minister, that you in your statement say, or in your opening contribution, you say that it's going to increase for some categories in the lower, up to 1700 cc, of between 14 and 38 per year. I have a car that's below that size, and I had an increase of €50, so I don't know where you're getting your figures from. Well, it's a Yaris. It's a small car with less than 1,000 cc, and it went up by 50. I don't imagine that it's going to destroy the planet on its own. But I'm just saying to your numbers, your numbers appear to be wrong. And then just in the last month. Just in the last month, Minister, just a practical example of it. You're also talking about how much of an increase it is, and going to 44 cents a week if there's an increase of €23 a year. The problem is, there's a failure for this government to actually look at the cumulative effect of all of these things. And I think people were really insulted when you start saying things like the household charge was €2 a week. Because the reality of it is that that's not your money, Minister. That's the money that's in somebody's pocket that's struggling, that has utility bills that are going up, that has an income that's going down, that has a mortgage payment that's going up, that's a rent that's going up. And it's the cumulative effect of all of those things that are absolutely destroying families. And it's insulting to reduce it to that that type of statement. It's as though there was nothing else happening, and I think you've got to consider how people's households are impacted. As I said, many people have no choice but to use their cars. Many of the public transport routes are being discontinued, or you're finding towns bypassed because of cost-saving measures, because obviously the like of the national transport provider is in a serious deficit situation, and you know some of these services can only be viably delivered if they're subsidised, and there isn't the ability to subsidise that. We also have, and it's not of your making, Minister, but we also have a settlement pattern that is a non-sustainable settlement pattern with, I think, some of the largest per capita. It's certainly one of the largest road mileage systems in the world because of the way our settlement pattern has developed. But that brings with itself a need for road maintenance that has to be taken into account. There's something like 700,000 people travel to and from school or work by car every day. In parts of Kildare, about 2/3 of people commute. Combined with high fuel prices and falling wages, this does impose additional and serious additional financial pressure. RTE did a programme there not that long ago about Rochford Bridge, which is seen as a dormitory town, ironically. But it's showing how people are failing to even be in a position to seek work because of the costs of the prohibitive costs of transport. Most of them can only rely on private transport, and I think we've got to look at this in a broader sense. Yes, in relation to the fund, I mean, obviously you're saying that 150 million addition has been taken out of the local government fund. I remember the advertisements that were placed by your department last year when there was a pressure for people to pay the household charge, and there was all sorts of wrong claims made about how this was going to go towards maintaining parks and playgrounds and all sorts of things. The reality of it is the local authorities now have very significantly less, and they will have less again. Essentially, what people are going to be asked to pay for, they're going to be asked to pay for more, and they're going to see a reduced service. In relation to roads, we're seeing roads failing all over the country. Deputy Cowan made the point about the type of foundations in the road system in parts of the Midlands, and that will include parts of Kildare. The level of usage, obviously, the two very severe winters we haven't really recovered from. And indeed, I can see us going back to doing what a predecessor of yours did, Minister, in a few years to come, if the roads are neglected in the way they were, and that is that we'll, I'll quote, we'll go back to having a war on potholes, because we're starting to see them appear and appearing in numbers, and there's competition around the country, as you know, in relation to some of the more extreme the extreme cases. Grants for road maintenance have fallen from 363 million in 2007 to 232 million this year. Local authorities contributed 406 million from their budgets on regional and local roads in 2008. This has fallen to 175 million last year. And I don't think they're willingly decreasing the amount. I think that they have no choice but to decrease the amount, because in many cases the level of discretionary funds is such that they simply don't have the money to spend. After wages, heat and light, insurance, running wastewater treatment plants and all of the rest of it, after that is decided, clearly then you see what's available in terms of the roads fund. Minister Varadkar, just the other evening, when he was answering questions, was talking about the considerable difference in the amount spent on road maintenance improvements by local authorities across the country. Some spend as little as 8%, while others spend as much as 66% of their budget. That comes very much down to the level of discretion that's available. And Minister, one of the things I think at this stage, that needs to be considered in that context is the needs and resources model, which is a very discriminatory model, because it's looking at the historical situation, and areas that are rapidly developing have new needs simply don't have those needs counted. And if you start looking at things, for example, again in your own department, like for example and I know there's an examination happening at the moment on it, the disabled person grants. Some local authorities simply can't come up with the local contribution to the extent that it needs to be come up with, and you can see that the level of discretion in some local authorities is better than it is in others, and the ones that are regarded as wealthy counties are very often not wealthy at all, because they're the ones that have a limited ability to draw that down. And that can account for the low level of money that is distributed to road maintenance from some local authorities. So I think that needs to be seriously looked at. The other element of this bill, which I think is a really important element, and others have drawn attention to it, and rightly so, is the major issue of the destruction of our environment. The way this tax is designed is really not going to reward good behaviour. In fact, it reverses what had been done in terms of the culture changing in relation to the kind of vehicles people chose. The thing about it is, what's immediately clear is from the changes being made is that no good deed will go unpunished by this government. As I've said, motor tax has increased several times since this government came to power, and in each case the person who made the conscious move towards the lower emissions engines was punished, and punished severely, and this bill continues that. A 92% increase, as I mentioned earlier, applies to the people in the Band A for emissions. So if you did the good thing several years ago by trading down your emissions, you get severely punished today. Encouraging positive environmental behaviour through taxation is a tried and tested method, and there's wider societal advantages to doing that, and it makes good economic sense, because we will at some point have to buy carbon credits if we don't meet our targets, and whether those targets are included or not included in a bill here, we do have international obligations. But such taxation requires trust on the part of the taxpayer. And the reality of it is that that trust is being destroyed by the approach that is being taken, because we're not rewarding positive behaviour. This is the same, obviously, approach with regard to carbon tax. Not ring-fencing it and putting it into a general fund means that essentially it's not a carbon tax at all. It's just another tag that you put onto general taxation. What should be happening is that it goes into a fund, and that fund then is provided for retrofitting or wind energy and so on and so forth. We're also placing our obligations to reduce emissions in serious jeopardy. Transport makes up 21% of our national emissions profile, and most of it is outside of the emissions trading scheme. We're expecting a climate change bill, I think, Minister, it was next week that we were told last week, and we'll wait for that. But going on the example of today's behaviour, it's obvious that the priority for government is not being backed up by the practical delivery of things that change people's behaviour. Just to finish on a couple of things, the settlement pattern, and I know that it's intended to produce a new national spatial strategy, but I think that there's clearly it's clear if it never was before that the dispersed nature of the way we have gone about our settlement pattern has caused us and is going to cause us very serious problems in the future, and I don't believe that you can disassociate that from the kind of thing that's included in this bill today. I don't know if there's a way of looking at how you can unpick that, but clearly, if you're going to be putting cars out of people's reach in terms of being able to run a car for services, I think on the other side, you've got to provide public transport to allow people to function, and clearly we're neither doing one thing nor the other. Thank you.
Good morning. Next speaker is Deputy Sean Kenny.
Thanks, Cathaoirleach. The primary purpose of this bill is to give a permanent basis in law to the increases in motor tax rates and trade plate licences contained in Budget 2013. And for licences commencing on or after the 1st of January 2013, flat rate increases of between €10 and €92 apply to private vehicles taxed on the basis of carbon emissions. Rates for private electric vehicles were reduced to €120 per annum. Increases of 7.5% apply to all other vehicles. Trade plate licences also increased by 7.5%. The bill provides that the new rates of motor tax and fees for trade plates apply to licences taken out for periods beginning on or after the 1st of January 2013, and that all veteran and vintage vehicles will be exempt from the new regimes. A review of the carbon banding of vehicles for VRT and motor tax was carried out in 2012. Following the review, the lowest emitting bands A and B were broken into 6 separate bands for motor tax purposes, along with a further 0 ban for privately owned vehicles. The proposals under Budget 13C an across-the-board increase of 7.5% on cars registered before 2008, meaning cars with a 2-litre engine will see an annual tax bill go from €660 per annum to 710. A more modest 1.4-litre car will increase from €358 to €385 per annum, and the smallest car with a 1-litre engine, such as my own, will go from €278 per annum to €289 per annum. In pure monetary terms, it is true that cars with higher emissions will continue to see their tax bill increases, with the least eco-friendly cars seeing an increase of €92 per annum. The owners of cars with lower or no emissions will see their tax bills fall. Emission-free cars bought since 2008 or electric cars bought before then will see their tax fall by almost a quarter to a flat rate of €120 per annum. While increased taxes on cars are required given the economic situation the country is in, I would suggest that they're moving in the right direction, given that those with the most environmental cars are still required to pay less tax. People will be looking to buy cars in the future, and I would advise that they should consider smaller cars that have smaller engines and therefore emit less carbon dioxide and help our climate and make a contribution to dealing with climate change. People should also consider purchasing electrical cars where possible, and I would call on the manufacturers of these vehicles to work towards making them cheaper to own, cheaper to purchase, and easier to avail of than they are at present. I think we should also consider the alternatives available for commuters who currently travel to work by car. I think it's important to remind the House that people who avail of public transport can avail of the tax saver commuter ticket scheme, which was established as an incentive for the use of public transport. These public transport commuter tickets can be availed of when travelling to work by public transport by bus or by rail service or by Luce. The scheme also includes the Luce. And it also applies where a ticket covers more than one mode of transport or more than one operator, for example. An integrated ticket covering Luce, Dart, or Dublin Bus or Bus Éireann. This incentive, I think these incentives are a means of trying to encourage people to switch to using public transport and also to reduce traffic congestion. Employees receiving tickets either as part of their salary package or in lieu of an annual cash bonus are as a benefit in kind. Savings arise because the tickets are not subject to tax or to PRSI. Employees have only got to pay tax and PRSI on the money portion of their salary. Employer PRSI is also calculated on the money proportion of the salary. There is a benefit to both the employee and the employer through this scheme. Leap cards, which were introduced during the lifetime of the present government, are another incentive towards using public transport and are proving to be a huge success in its use across multiple public transport modes across the Dublin region. And I understand that the leap cards will eventually be extended to outside of Dublin, and I welcome that also. Another alternative to the private car, travelling to work by private car, is the Cycle to Work scheme, a tax incentive scheme which aims to encourage employees to cycle to work, not just as a means of reducing traffic, but I would suggest for health reasons and for tackling the problem of obesity. Under the scheme, employers can pay for vehicles and cycle equipment for their employees, and the employee pays back through a salary sacrifice arrangement up to 12 months. The employee is not liable for tax, PRSI or universal social charge on their repayments. And I believe where possible people should use public transport, particularly in cities, and where public transport is not available, I would encourage the government to look towards examining major public transport solutions for areas that are clearly in need of such solutions. As well, I think they should look at previous projects that had to be put on ice for the time being. Thank you.
This bill provides for more taxation, pure and simple. Additional taxation for almost every household in the country, targeting effectively lower and middle income families once again. The AA claims, and in fact has stated publicly, that there's no way to dress it up. It says, the car tax increase announced today will push up the cost of living for car owners, affecting almost every household in the country. For cars that are already on the road, this is a tax increase, pure and simple. Conor Faulkner of the same organisation said drivers of older vehicles will feel harshly treated. Those pre-2008 cars are already highly taxed and they are not luxuries. In many cases, ordinary motorists can barely afford to keep them on the road. For anyone who bought a low-emission car on a low-tax promise, this is the day when the promise was broken. It's clearly an act of bad faith affecting 300,000 motorists who believed the promise and bought a cleaner, greener car in the last 4 years. And we know that the greatest percentage increase in motor taxation for those driving carbon-efficient vehicles, they will experience the greatest distributional advantage brought about by the changes in the bill. So this is a tax measure, pure and simple, another method of extracting tax from ordinary householders. We have a 19.8% increase, and that's on the back of huge increases last year again. I think I recall something in the region of 50%, between 50 and 40%. And 82% of households are going to be affected by this increase. The owners of 1.8 or 1.9 million cars in the country. But 82% of households are going to be directly affected by this tax. And I think it's important to remember that statistics that are out recently show clearly that a typical family their purchasing power has reduced by 10.8% in the last 2 years. And that doesn't take into account, for instance, the cost of electricity, the cost of gas, the cost of the new water charge, which is going to come in on the 1st of January next year, the cost of refuse charges. Neither does it include the cost of clothing, footwear or replacement furniture. So here we have a typical family with huge reductions in their purchasing power over the last few years, and here we have another tax which is effectively targeted at them. It also calls into question the government's commitment to the motor industry. And the motor industry, as we all know, is simply hanging on by its fingertips. I think the reduction in cars purchased last year was in the region of 10,000. There was a huge reduction again in January of this year. Now, I know the Minister is going to tell me that there'll be re-registration of cars again in July. But the fact of the matter is that the industry is on its knees, hanging by its fingertips. And again, this is another tax which will certainly not help the sale of new cars, will not help the jobs in that industry, will ensure that less cars are bought and that more jobs are put in jeopardy. Now, the Minister has referred to the road fund, and I'm sure I heard him say that 150 million is going to be taken from the fund to pay down debt. Well, here we go again. We're paying debt services and paying debt that is not our debt, never was our debt, and shouldn't be our debt. And of course, what all that means is that the road fund monies available to local authorities is again reduced this year. Deputy Murphy has said, I think, that the figure have come down from 363 million to 270 million. And certainly the road funds for South Tipperary County Council, my constituency, have been down again significantly this year. And of course what that means is that very, very many roads right throughout the country, and I know at first hand the situation in South Tipperary, very many roads, county roads and minor roads, are in absolutely atrocious conditions. Absolutely atrocious conditions. And I have, on a regular basis, constituents into my office with invoices for the repair of their cars. I had one man into me recently who had a vehicle which was NCT tested and roadworthy currently, and the car had to go to the breaker's yard because the roads in his area, and he brought me out to see them, were absolutely a complete, almost continuous pothole. And that is evident right throughout the country. Today in the newspapers and the media we heard of a St. Patrick's Day parade which had to be abandoned because of potholed roads. So here again, you know, the monies that are being paid into the road fund should be put to use for repairing roads throughout the country and properly funding local authorities to do that. I mean, I had to smile when I heard Deputy Kenny talk about alternative modes of transport. Of course, it's quite clear that he lives in Dublin. But certainly, unless you live in one of the cities or in one of the larger urban areas, and cities, effectively cities, there is very little public transport. In fact, no public transport in most cases. People are absolutely dependent on their cars to go to work, if they have work, to take their children to school, to go shopping, to go to a football match or whatever. They don't have the option of getting on the Dart or the Lewis or bus transport. It's simply not available. and where it was available, it's been reduced. There's been a recent closure. There's been a recent closure on the railway line from Limerick to Clonmel, for instance, and on to Waterford. And again, that's not just in South Tipperary, that's right throughout the country. So the availability of alternative transport arrangements might be available in Dublin, but it's certainly not available throughout the country, and certainly not in rural areas. And as I mentioned that, I would ask the Minister to talk to his colleague, Minister Kelly, in relation to the Rural Transport Initiative. We certainly have a very effective and well-run rural transport service in South Tipperary. Now it appears the Minister wants to dismantle that service. It's a community-based service, community-operated and community-run. And it's a very effective and an excellent service, particularly for elderly people who live in rural areas where there is no public transport. It appears now that the Minister wants to dismantle that system. And I certainly say to him, hands off the Rural Transport Initiative and hands off the system that is working absolutely well and effectively in South Tipperary. The other two quick things that I wanted to mention, last Corla, is again, even in Dublin, these increases will again have the effect of increased taxi fares, I'm sure. And of course, the whole increase coming to about 100 million will take a further 100 million out of the economy, and it continues the whole policy of austerity and withdrawing monies from the economy, and thereby ensuring that there's less money to go around, there's less money in people's pockets, less money to keep shops open and people in employment. And it's just simply the wrong policy being operated by this government since it came to power. I came across recently a constituent who, and I finish with this, Corla, who for a long number of years had purchased a motorhome and brought it over from England, imported it into this country from England, and obviously had to have it registered, etc., and checked here, and there was a payment for that. Obviously, was €200. That constituent recently made inquiries in relation to the position now, and it now transpired that to do the same this year, and this cost €200, it now will cost 13.3% of the market value of the motorhome. In this case, something like €4,000. Huge increase. And I'd ask the Minister to look into that, because it doesn't seem right that you could have an increase of registration of such a vehicle from €200 to 13.3% or €4,000. As I said, Corla, this bill is simply another form of general taxation targeted at families.
Now, I think it's time to call the Minister for the Environment, Phil Hogan, to reply.
Corla, I'd like to thank the deputies who contributed to this debate, and I note what they're saying, and I haven't said anything different myself, that any increase in taxation is unwelcome, particularly for a citizen, and in view of the fact that this is the second increase in as many years. It is an unavoidable fact that the new CO2-based system introduced in July 2008 by my predecessors resulted in, over time, in a decline in motor tax receipts. And as Deputy Healy rightly pointed out, it didn't help the motor trade, the manner in which it was implemented at the time. Instead of the switch being revenue neutral, while also providing an environmental incentive towards more fuel-efficient cars, which was what was the stated intention at the time, The tax was structured in such a way that in the absence of budget increases, the effect by the time the switch to CO2 taxation is completed in the next decade and a half, the tax base would have shrunk by 50%. So where do we get the money to fund the local services if a fund like that has shrunk by 50%? Now, this will be exacerbated as technologies improve, which is mandated through the EU for a greater proportion of cars being ever more efficient in the future. And the majority of the new registrations, as I said, are in the lowest tax band.